If your organization has successfully been using Tally ERP for the last many years and it's time to consider an upgrade, I'm going to talk today about how to migrate from Tally ERP to a new ERP solution. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting Group. We're an independent ERP consulting firm that helps clients through their digital transformation journeys. And many of our small and mid-sized companies in India and other parts of the Middle East and some other countries used Tally from the time they were younger, smaller organizations. It's a very good product, a very widely used and widely adopted product. But many of those same organizations grow over time. They expand internationally. They create a certain amount of scale and diversity that can create a certain amount of strain on the Tally ERP system. So in today's video, I want to talk about how to define whether or not it's time to move away from Tally ERP, and if so, what is it we need to do to find the best path forward. So the first thing we have to do in considering our path forward is to ask ourselves, are we ready to upgrade? Are we sure we want to upgrade from Tally ERP? And the reason I say this is for a few reasons. First of all, Tally ERP, as I mentioned before, is a very well-known system. It's got a lot of great functionality. It's very well established, especially in the region that you're probably operating in India or Middle East or wherever you may be based. So the first thing to ask would be, do we want to upgrade to a newer version of Tally? Tally is consistently putting out new releases and new versions with new capabilities and functionalities. So it may not be that Tally itself is a problem if you're not on the most recent system. So that would be the first question to ask is, are we on the most recent version of the system? Do we want to upgrade that solution first, or at least consider upgrading that solution first? The other reason why it's important to ask and make sure that we're sure we want to move away from Tally ERP is because sometimes the grass can seem greener on the other side. We may think that a new system is going to replace some of the problems we have with our current legacy environment. So oftentimes it can be beneficial to ask ourselves, have we gotten the most out of that system? Or is there functionality even in our current version that we're not deployed, that maybe we're not using correctly? Or perhaps there's user issues or training issues that people don't understand how to use the system more effectively. Perhaps people are reverting back to their old spreadsheets or manual processes. So those are all the types of questions we want to ask first. Is it really Tally that's the problem that we want to upgrade from? Or is it truly a situation where we have grown as an organization, we've become more complex, we're more global, and we've really pushed the boundaries of what Tally can do? So that's the first question, is make sure that you're sure that you want to move away from Tally ERP. So if we are fairly certain that we want to move away from Tally, or even if we're still not sure after asking yourself some of the questions I just mentioned, the next step we want to go through is to define our current state processes and requirements, I should say. And the reason I say current state is because we want to understand how we're using the system now, and this may help us answer this question here. So if this isn't a clear answer for us, step number 2 will help us hopefully get to that right answer. So we want to define our current state processes and business requirements. And so we don't want to go into excruciating detail. We don't necessarily need to define hundreds or thousands of different business requirements, but we want to define our highest priority business requirements. So we can do one of two things. One would be to do a gap analysis against the most recent version of Tally, whether or not you're using that or whether there's a newer version out there on the market that might be available for you. We can use these current state processes and requirements to determine whether or not the gaps between what we want and what the newest version of Tally can do, whether or not that's going to be sufficient. The second thing this will do is to help us compare a Tally upgrade potentially, or staying on Tally. It'll help us compare that scenario to potentially moving to another system. So oftentimes what we find is when we're helping clients figure out what they want to do, moving from their current Tally situation, is first thing we'll say is, well, let's do a gap analysis to see if we can cover most of what we need here. And if there are big gaps here in terms of what it is we need and what we want going forward, then it's likely that we'll want to bring in a couple other options to consider. So this next step will be a good way to help us understand the lay of the land, understand how well we are or not using Tally the way it could be used, and also help us figure out if there are other options out there in the marketplace that might be a good fit. It also helps us identify the pain points, some of the challenges we're having in our current environment that we can either fix with new technology or with retraining or redefinition of business processes. So the next step in this whole journey and this whole strategy roadmap or planning of your path forward is going to be to define the types of systems you might be considering as alternatives. So we'll just call this define alternative systems. And there's a few different ways that this can work. So there's a few things to consider here when we're defining alternative systems. The first thing is we want to define, do we want to be on a cloud system? Do we want to move to a big ERP system, a big global complex ERP system, one of the tier 1 providers like SAP or Oracle or Microsoft? Now keep in mind that could be a potentially very big jump from your current state to one of those big systems, and we'll get to that here in a second. But that might be the best option for you depending on the type of organization you are and how much you've grown and how much you plan to grow in the future. It could also be that you want to look at open source options. That's another option that we see a lot of Tally customers consider, and some have migrated to, because it provides a good middle ground between what Tally can provide and some of the cost-effective functionality that you get with Tally to give you some other options and another set of functionality without having to jump all the way to a big tier 1 system. And then there's also the tier 2 system. So there's things like Epicor and Infor and certain industry niche focused solutions that might be able to be a good scalable product for you and a good upgrade from Tally to provide you some broader capabilities specifically within whatever industry you're in. So in general, there's 3 buckets that we just mentioned. So you've got the tier 1 systems that we might want to consider. So this will be, as I mentioned, the SAP, the Oracles of the world, D365, etc. There's also the tier 2, or we'll call this the tier 2 or industry focused solutions. So whatever industry you're in, if you're a manufacturer, which a lot of companies using Tally are manufacturers, those are situations where you might look at something like an Infor or Epicor, Plex Systems, some of those other options that are out there in the marketplace. You may also find that something like a NetSuite, which is a tier 2 product, but a very broad product, very scalable product, something that might be an upgrade from Tally, might be another option for you. And then finally, as I mentioned before, open source. So that's another common, popular alternative to Tally, which is to look at open source like Odoo and other open source systems that are out there. And again, that might be a more cost-effective solution than necessarily jumping to one of these options here. Now, one thing I'll point out here is we're looking at the types of systems we want to look at as part of our short list, is we want to make sure that we understand, coming back to this question here, are we sure we want to upgrade? We want to understand that there's a high likelihood that we're going to go from a relatively low-cost solution in Tally to something that might be more expensive, especially if we're talking about a subscription cloud-based solution like S/4HANA or Oracle ERP Cloud or NetSuite, whatever the case may be. Those products can end up being more expensive in the long term, so you just want to be aware of that and make sure that we're comfortable with that. But at this point, all we're really trying to do is figure out what type of solution do we think is going to be the best fit for us. So once we've considered our options and we've looked at the different types of systems we might be looking at, the next thing is to plan our path forward. So what is it we're going to do, basically, is the question we're asking here. So we'll plan our path forward. And there's a couple components of what I mean by this. One is to select the software. And there's a few different ways to do this. Now, one thing we do with our clients is we help them quickly narrow down to a short list and ultimately a decision on what software will be best, largely by using our experience with all the different solutions out there. We're an independent consulting firm, so we have hands-on experience helping clients evaluate and implement all the major leading products out there. So our qualitative experience can help make that decision. And we also license a database. We have an exclusive license for a database that allows us to analyze functionality quantitatively and look at what are the strengths and weaknesses and how do the different functions compare across the different solutions out there. So those are a couple different data points you can use to help at least narrow down to a short list, and then from there do the demo process and negotiations and figure out what system is best going to fit you and be that path forward, whether it's an upgrade of Tally or whether it's an alternative system that we determine is a better fit and a longer term ROI. The second thing we want to do within planning our path forward is just a plan for the transformation. So Tally is a very easy system to use. As I mentioned, very common. It's easy to find resources that have used Tally in the past. So we want to make sure that we account for that and understand that it might be a bit difficult for some people to move from Tally to a different type of system. From moving from an on-premise version of Tally to, say, a NetSuite or an open source product like Odoo, it's just going to have a totally different user interface and different look and feel and different way of deploying the technology. So we want to make sure that we have a solid organizational change plan to help people make that transition, and also make sure that we have a solid implementation strategy and plan for our organization to make sure that we're effectively implementing. Now, this is very important. It may sound like common sense, but when we look at organizations that have been using Tally for a long time, since they were a very small organization, now they've grown into these big, complex or global companies, a lot of times they don't realize through that growth how much more difficult it's going to be to implement a solution now that we're this big versus when we implemented Tally at this size. So you just want to make sure you've scaled what's needed for your implementation to account for those types of factors. So this is a summary of the major steps that we recommend for companies that are on Tally and trying to figure out what their paths forward might be. I encourage you to look at some of the videos I've included links to below, because I include a lot more detail on how we perform some of these tasks in those videos below. And I also encourage you to download our 2020 ERP report, which we recently published, and has a lot of best practices and guidance on how to best plan for a transformation, whether you're upgrading Tally or you're moving away from Tally to something different. That guide in that ERP report will be a great resource for you, and I've included a link below. I hope you found this information useful, and we'll look forward to chatting with you soon. Thanks.